We live in interesting times. An understatement, I know. Just considering the several active wars, the rise in fuel prices, and the political tension that has only been getting worse. There's plenty to lay in bed and worry about as is. Not to mention all the personal troubles that we have to either solve or live with on our own. Yes, it seems the modern world, for all it's good, has also snuck in misery we were not anticipating. Hardships that we did not bargain for. Perhaps there's some wisdom to be had then in that old saying, better the devil you know than the one you don't. What's really odd about modernity, though, is that it's not just the difficulty that unsettles us. Difficulty has been around for as long as anyone can remember. No, what's truly strange is that we don't seem to have a way of making sense of it anymore. Not just politically or economically, but at a deeper level. What things are, what they mean, what any of it's for. Modernity was supposed to usher in a kind of utopia, an era of peace and prosperity never seen before. The myths of old were to be done away with, and man was to become the master of his own destiny. Instead, we've become orphans in a world of our own making. And yet, for those willing to look, there are still stories that remember what we've forgotten. Stories that have proven more resilient than we thought. Stories that have been in the shadows, but are now coming back into the light. Strangely, one of these places is anime. While much of modern storytelling has moved on from myth, treating it as something outdated, symbolic, or even childish, anime has often done something very different. It treats myth as if it still matters, as if the world still has a structure to it, as if things really are something, and not just what we decide to make of them.
Mythical creatures are everywhere in anime, whether it is elves, dragons, demons, kaiju, homunculi, knockers, or ghouls. But our concern here isn't the creatures themselves, but the kind of world they belong to, the reality they assume. What do we mean by myth? If we look at something like a modern dictionary, we'll often find myth defined as a traditional story that explains the worldview of a people. But almost immediately, that definition begins to shift. Myth becomes something believed, but not true, something mistaken, and something false. And that shift matters, not because the dictionary is wrong, it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do, but because it reveals something about how we've come to think. Today, myth is often treated as what you move past once you know better. But historically, that wasn't the case. If you trace the word back, you'll find yourself at mythos, which does not mean falsehood, it means speech, story, even an authoritative account. It was not opposed to truth, it was a way of communicating it. For many cultures, myth was not entertainment. It was how reality was understood. Not just why things happen, but what things are, what matters, what kind of world we live in, and how we are meant to live within it. This is why the late M.Y.T.H, a prominent 20th century historian, described myth as a kind of true history, not necessarily in modern scientific sense, but as something that reveals the structure of reality itself, its patterns, its limits, its meaning. And that distinction is crucial, because if myth is reduced to something false, then any story that treats reality as structured, as meaningful, as ordered, will seem naive. But if myth is understood as a way of revealing reality, then some stories begin to look very different. That's the sense in which I am using the word here. Not as something childish, not as something outdated, but as a way of describing a world that already has an order to it, something we don't invent but discover. And once you begin to look at stories this way, a pattern starts to emerge. Reality presents itself as something structured. There is a metaphysical order that exists prior to us. That order carries limits, a yoke, boundaries that are not arbitrary, but meaningful. When those limits are crossed, we see transgression, a reaching beyond what is given, and from there the pattern completes itself into harvest. The consequence is the return, the fruit that is born. You reap what you sow. And with that in mind, we can begin to look at anime. Not just what happens, but to see how this pattern, myth, unfolds beneath the surface.
Let's start with the first layer of myth, the Metaphysical Order. In Demon Slayer, there exists an objective moral order, one that does not originate with the characters, but instead stands above them, quietly governing the world they inhabit. And what's striking about this is how immediately recognizable it is. Unlike the moral ambiguity that tends to dominate much of modern storytelling, Demon Slayer does not hesitate to draw a distinction between what is good and what is evil. Tanjiro and those he fights alongside are not simply positioned on one side of a conflict. They are aligned with something real, something ordered, something that stands in direct opposition to what seeks to corrupt and consume. At the center of that opposition is Muzan Kibutsuji. Now, Muzan is not misunderstood, nor is he merely the product of circumstances. The story makes it clear that even before becoming a demon, there was something deeply disordered in him. His transformation does not create that, it reveals it. As a demon, he becomes more fully what he already was, a being that consumes others for the sake of itself. And that distinction matters, because it means the conflict is not simply a matter of perspective. It is not something to be reasoned away or reinterpreted. It is something that must be faced. This is what it means for a story to operate within a metaphysical order. A world where good and evil are not constructed by the characters, but discovered by them. But a world like that does not just have structure, it also has limits. Which brings us to the next layer of myth. Why? The Yoke. You see this most clearly in the contrast between Rengoku and Akaza. Akaza rejects limitations. He pursues strength for its own sake, power unbound by mortality, unrestrained by finitude. By becoming a demon, he escapes the constraints of human life, gaining the ability to refine himself indefinitely. Strength, for him, becomes the highest good, precisely because it is no longer bound to anything outside of itself. Rengoku, on the other hand, accepts the yoke. Despite his mortality, despite knowing that his life is finite, he does not see limitation as something to escape, but something that gives his strength meaning. Power, for him, is not an end, but a responsibility. It is something given to be used rightly, to protect, to serve, to stand in defense of others, even when it demands everything from him. Both are powerful, both are disciplined, but only one lives within the structure of the world. Because the yoke is not arbitrary, it is not imposed from the outside, it is built into the reality itself, and how one responds to it determines everything. And when that yoke is rejected, the pattern continues. This is where we see T, or transgression. Muzan's entire existence is built on this. He does not merely live outside the limits of the world, he's actively seeking to overturn them. He consumes others, he reshapes them, and extends himself through them. He refuses to remain within the boundaries given to him, and Akaza falls in the same direction. His pursuit of strength is not neutral. It is not simply ambition, it is a reaching beyond what is given, an attempt to redefine what it means to be human by discarding humanity altogether. And in a mythic world, that kind of transgression does not remain unanswered, which leads us to the final movement, harvest. Because what Demon Slayer shows us is that actions do not disappear, they return. You see this most interestingly in Tanjiro. Time and time again, he shows compassion toward the demons he kills, not because of what they have become, but because of what they once were. He does not hesitate to act when they threaten others. He does not waver when it comes to protecting the innocent. But neither does he allow himself to be consumed by hatred or cynicism. He refuses to let evil define him, and that too is part of the harvest. Because in many modern stories, the hero becomes indistinguishable from what he fights. Violence justifies more violence. Vengeance consumes everything. Popular figures like John Wick or the Punisher operate within a kind of ruthless efficiency, often collapsing the distinction between justice and retribution. But Tanjiro's different. He takes no pleasure in the deaths he causes. He does not celebrate them. Instead, he reflects, quietly, consistently, with a kind of sobriety. As the demons fade to dust, he recognizes them not as monsters to merely be discarded, but as people who have lost their way. Justice is carried out, but mercy is not abandoned. And that is the deeper harvest of the story. Not just that evil is punished, but that goodness, rightly lived, bears fruit of its own kind. Which means that in Demon Slayer, we are not just watching a battle between characters. We are watching the full pattern of myth unfold. A world with a real metaphysical order, a humanity placed under a meaningful yoke, a rebellion that takes the form of transgression, and a reality that answers back through harvest.
Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood follows the journey of the Elric brothers, Elward and Alphonse, two young alchemists who, after a failed attempt to bring their mother back from the dead, set out in a search of the Philosopher's Stone, in the hope of restoring their bodies. What begins as a personal quest, however, quickly unfolds into something far larger, an intricate narrative shaped by hidden truths, buried history in the world that refuses to bend to human desire. And that refusal is the key. Because in this world, reality is not neutral, it is ordered. The law of equivalent exchange is not simply a rule of alchemy, but a reflection of something deeper. To gain something of equal value must be given. That principle is not advisory or flexible, it is absolute. And it is what myth names as the yoke, a limit built into the structure of reality itself, not imposed from the outside but woven into the fabric of the world. And once that yoke is in place, the rest of the pattern follows, because when it is violated, reality answers. You see this most clearly in the moment that sets the entire story in motion. Ed and Al attempt to bring their mother back through human transmutation, reaching beyond what is permitted. That is transgression, and the result is immediate and catastrophic. Ed loses a leg, Al loses his entire body, and only by sacrificing his arm is Ed able to bind Al's soul to a suit of armor. This is not simply failure, it is a harvest. In a world like this, actions do not remain isolated, they return, they bear weight, and they exact a cost. What makes Fullmetal Alchemist so compelling, however, is that this pattern does not stop at a single moment, it deepens. Because beneath the surface, alchemy is not merely a system that can be mastered, but something governed by a higher reality the show refers to as truth. The gates they pass through, marked with those intricate, almost tree-like structures, point beyond the system itself to something that cannot be manipulated, bypassed, or overcome. This is the Metaphysical Order, the foundation beneath the yoke itself. And once you see it, the entire story begins to cohere. The Philosopher's Stone, built on human lives, eventually exhausts themselves and crumble. The homunculi, despite their longevity, cannot escape what they are. Al's armor-bound soul begins to destabilize, and Nina and Alexander's fusion stands as a quiet horror that cannot be undone. Every thread points in the same direction. The world does not bend, and what is done within it does not disappear, it returns. Which means, what Fullmetal Alchemist reveals is not just that the reality has limits, but that those limits are grounded in something deeper. The moral direction we recognize in Demon Slayer is not merely intuitive, it is structural. The world does not merely suggest what is right and wrong, it enforces it. And yet, even with all of that in place, even if reality has order, even if it has limits, even if it answers back, that does not mean we understand it, because meaning is not always something we grasp in the moment. More often than not, it is something we only recognize after the fact.
If in Demon Slayer, we see that reality has a moral shape, and in Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, we see that this structure carries limits, and that violating those limits brings consequences, then Frieren, Beyond Journey's End, asks a different question. What happens when all of this is true, but we fail to recognize it? Because in Frieren, the structure of reality does not disappear. It remains, but our awareness of it does not. The story begins where most others would end, with the defeat of the Demon King. The great battle has already been fought, the world has already been saved, and yet the story does not dwell there. Instead, it turns backward, not to relive the victory, but to reconsider what it meant. Over the course of 10 years, Frieren traveled alongside Hyder, Eisen, and Himmel. For them, That journey was everything, the defining chapter of their lives. But for Frieren, it was almost nothing. Not because those moments lacked meaning, but because she did not perceive them as meaningful. And this is where Frieren reframes the pattern of myth. The metaphysical order is still present. The world still has a rich structure, and relationships still carry weight, and the moments do matter. Frieren clearly lives within that order, but she does not yet see it. And because she does not see it, she fails to live fully within the yoke of that reality. Not in open rebellion, but in quiet neglect. She does not reject meaning, but merely overlooks it. 10 years pass, and she treats them as though they were fleeting, disposable, replaceable. But the pattern does not break simply because it is ignored. Eventually, it does continue, and the harvest comes. Not immediately, as we saw in Fullmetal Alchemist, not in catastrophe or correction, but later, through time. Himmel dies. Years pass, Hyder follows. And as time continues forward, something begins to happen. Those moments return to her. Conversations she barely considered. Gestures she did not linger on. Relationships she assumed would always be there. They return, but now with weight. Not because they have changed, but because she finally has. This is what Frieren reveals that most other stories only imply. The harvest is not dependent on our awareness of it. Meaning does not wait for us to notice it. It does not require our attention to be real. It simply is. And time does not create that meaning. It reveals it, slowly, patiently, and sometimes painfully. What Frieren comes to understand is not that her journey lacked meaning, but that she failed to recognize it while she had it. And that realization cannot be undone. The cost is not physical, but temporal. The weight of what cannot be revisited, only remembered. And with that, the pattern completes itself. A world with a real metaphysical order, a life lived within a meaningful yoke, a failure not through rebellion but through blindness, and a harvest that comes whether we are ready for it or not.
We live in a time that has, in many ways, moved beyond myth. Or at least it believes that it has. The stories we tell ourselves now often operate as if the world has no given structure, no inherent direction, no meaning beyond what we decide to assign to it. Good and evil become matters of perspective. Limits become things to overcome, and reality itself becomes something to shape rather than something to understand. But as we've seen, that way of telling stories comes at a cost, because when myth is stripped away, what's lost is not tradition or symbolism, it's the very framework that allows us to make sense of the world at all. What these stories recover is not something new, but something far older, not a different way of imagining reality, but a recognition of how it already is. That reality has a metaphysical order, a structure that does not originate with us, but confronts us. That this order carries a yoke, limits that are not arbitrary but meaningful. That stepping outside of those limits is not neutral but transgression, a refusal to live within what is given. And that what we do does not disappear, but returns as harvest, whether immediately, as in Fullmetal Alchemist, or slowly, as in Frieren. This pattern that myth has always laid out, and it is not something we invented, it is something we keep running into. Because the world does not wait for us to interpret it before it begins to act on us. It does not bend simply because we no longer believe in its structure. It remains what it is, and we remain within it, whether we recognize it or not. And perhaps that is part of why stories like these resonate. Not simply because they are well written, or beautifully animated, or emotionally compelling, but because they restore a way of seeing things that many have lost. They remind us that we are not the authors of reality, but participants in it. That meaning is not something we create, but something we encounter. And that learning to live within that reality is not a restriction, but the beginning of understanding.